G'day, y'all. This is episode number one of The Matt Sweeny Show. I talk with G. Edward Griffin about freedom. Let's go.
Well, thank you, Matthew, for inviting me. It's my honor and my pleasure to be on your show.
So, the approach I'm taking to this interview today is speaking the truth in love, which is actually a quote from Ephesians 4:15 in the Bible.
Yes. Well, that's a very interesting topic. It sounds so simple, but it's very complex, isn't it?
Yes.
What is this thing, love, and
And
how
truth.
far does it go? And truth. Wow, we could talk all year on that. So,
Well,
yes, that's
Let,
good.
let's get started. Where I am just super interested to start is that you interviewed Yuri Bezmenov in 1984, which is 40 years ago. And for our viewers, I'd like to summarize who Yuri Bezmenov was and what he said, and then we can jump into the details.
Sure. Well, we can start on the very simple, condensed version. Yuri Bezmenov was a former a KGB agent in Soviet Union. He was born into a high-ranking military family. His father was a general in the Soviet Army. So he was born into a classless society, they say, but he was in the upper class of the classless society, and he had everything. He lived very well. His family had all the food and privileges and clothing and advantages and a lot of free stuff from the state, and driven around in a limousine probably, or at least a car, and so he was naturally selected to go into the KGB as a young man. He probably I talked at length with him. His attitude when I talked to him was that it was a horrible experience, but I think probably as a young man, he probably thought it was pretty cool. I didn't question him on that, but I understood his position of being an American now, and not wanting to say, yeah, I was in the KGB, wasn't that wonderful? But whatever his opinion was in the beginning, he came out the other end of it with a very sour opinion, because he was one of these people with a high quotient of this thing called love that you speak about. He had respect for his fellow human beings in spite of all the training and all the propaganda and all the conditioning that was going on in the Soviet Union. He had everything you could possibly want, all the privileges, all the prestige. He was traveling around the world as a KGB agent trying to subvert other countries, spent a lot of time in India, fell in love with Indians and the culture there, and that was his weakness too. He had love, he liked things, and he didn't want to destroy things, but his job was to destroy things. His job in particular, his specialty when he was working as an agent in the Soviet Union, was to hoodwink journalists from the Western world who were coming from the United States and Europe, all the non-communist countries, to see if what they heard about life in the Soviet Union was really as bad as people said. They wanted to see it for themselves. So, of course, the KGB was not stupid. They said, well, sure, come on over. We'll show you it's all a big lie what they say about us. And so it was Yuri's job to greet these journalists, which usually came over in small groups, and meet them at the airport, take them to the finest hotel they could find. It had in Moscow, primarily for tourists and dignitaries like that. Get them drunk as quickly as possible, keep them drunk, get them a lot of good food, and then when their defenses were down and they were sort of staggering around, they'd take them on tours around Moscow or any place they wanted to go. They'd take them to see weddings in the cathedral, because we had been told that they don't have religious ceremonies anymore. You don't even have weddings with a priest or anything. Well, there was one in Moscow. Of course, it was all staged. It was all managed, and he had to laugh about that. He said they had a bride and the groom that got married 3 times a week, the same bride and the same groom. And the wedding party, they had it pretty cool because they could go and drink champagne and dance and have good food and laugh. And the journalists were taking pictures, and all this. It's all a big show. Well, would you like to see some of our prisons? Oh, yeah, we heard these prisons are terrible. So they take him to a model prison where the food was good, the accommodations were nice. And that was his job, is just to hoodwink the journalists and show them how good life was really under Soviet communism. And the journalists fell for it. There was a big article in Life, Time, well, I guess it was Life magazine, with one group that he showed pictures of those people who were there, and he took them around and hoodwinked them. Anyway, that's what he did, and he was finally assigned to a post in India where they were recruiting intellectuals, primarily from academia, teachers and writers and artists and so forth, and convincing them that the Soviet style of life was the purest form there was, and there'd be no selfishness and no greed, and everybody would, have milk and honey, and everything would be wonderful. And but he knew it was a lie, and he knew what was going on back in his homeland, and he saw how cruel the system was, and how people were literally murdered for their beliefs, and religion was not free to engage in, and the only ones that were the priests were actually communist agents in disguise. He was explaining all that they had a lot of priests who had gone through seminary schools and so forth, and they actually were ordained, some of them, and a lot of them just pretended to be ordained. You didn't have to prove it to anybody. So anyway, he saw the deception behind the whole system. He saw the reality of life, what it really was like, and it disgusted him. He wanted no part of it, and a great risk to his life. He escaped from India. There were a lot of American hippies there to visit with the gurus and smoke hashish and marijuana and think, I understand with I'm in communication with the universe and all that. So he said the Soviets didn't invent that, but they welcomed it because they could see that it would take a lot of these young Americans, and from Europe too, young people with high ideals and great intelligence, most of them, but get into this lifestyle where all they had to do is be at one with the universe. Meanwhile, the real war is going on around them, so they're out of the battle. They liked it a lot, and so he was there, and he talked a lot about that sort of thing. But then he figured he would escape from all of this by pretending to be a hippie. So he dressed up like a hippie, had long hair, and bare feet. I guess I didn't see the feet or anything, and he got a visa or something out of India, passage somehow, as an American hippie, and that's how he got to Canada first, and then to the United States to tell his story. So that's who Yuri Bezmenov was. He's a very fascinating person. We did this interview at someone's home in Beverly Hills. It had a nice setting there. And I just asked him a lot of direct questions. He told his story. And that video was not very well viewed or received when I produced it. And I thought, well, nobody's interested in this. Isn't that a shame? And I kind of put it on the shelf. And then many years later, somebody said, you produced a video interviewing Yuri Bezmenov. We saw it on the internet the other day. It was really great. I said, what? How did it get there?
Well, I'll tell you that video has stood the test of time. And I think that a big part of the reason why is because it seems to explain a lot of what's happening in our society today. So if I could, I'd like to, in my own words, kind of share my understanding of the hypothesis that Yuri put forward in that interview with you and in his books, and see if I'm saying this correctly. So I think the hypothesis that Yuri puts forward is that communists are at war with America. This is an ideological or a moral war between the collectivist ideology behind communism versus the individualist ideology behind the founding of America. And that the communists early on realized that they couldn't defeat America militarily or economically, so they looked for a different weapon. And the weapon that they chose is a form of brainwashing of the American people that they called ideological subversion or active measures. And the principle behind this weapon is actually found in Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which says that excellence in warfare is breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. So it's a way of fighting a war without actual fighting until the last stage. And so what is this? Well, ideological subversion is a long-term process that is about demoralizing entire generations by attacking key areas, including religion, education, and media. And there are other areas within the target nation that get attacked, including law and order and family, but these are some of the key areas. And so this brainwashing attack changes the victim's perception of reality and causes them to believe that communism or collectivism is a viable alternative to capitalism or individualism. One thing that I found interesting that Yuri said is that this attack is irreversible, because once this ideology takes hold on someone's mind, it's impossible to re-educate them until they see the consequences of this ideology, by which point it's too late. And another just really interesting anecdote is that Yuri said that the communist leaders who are behind these attacks actually instructed him not to look for true believers in communism, to work with him. In other words, they wanted him to look for people who were willing to compromise their moral principles, so that the people in power at the KGB know this for them is about power and money. It's not about ideology. And where sort of this became very interesting is that he said, follow the money. He said that 80 to 85% of the KGB's resources were poured into this attack, which means it basically was funded with unlimited money. And this attack began in about the 1960s, meaning that America today is 3 to 4 generations into this attack. And the logic behind this attack is that when it brainwashes enough people within a generation, it leads to a civil war or an internal revolution, undermining America from within. And that the end goal of this attack is to turn America from an open society to a closed society, to merge into one global system. And Yuri ended by saying that America is the last frontier of freedom in the world. To quote Yuri, "And believe me, if you destroy your system, you will have no place to defect to, because your country is the last hope for mankind's survival, freedom, and justice." So it seems like Yuri was aware of an attack on America that was playing the long game, that we're only really starting to see the results of today. So, is this an accurate summary of your understanding of the attack that Yuri Bezmenov described?
Yes, I think it's highly accurate. You're to be congratulated for picking up. I think if I was hanging on to it, I think you picked up all the major points of what he was trying to communicate. The question marks I might throw out is not so much what he said, but what he didn't say about this attack, simply because there wasn't enough time to amplify these things. It was an attack, but we would probably call it, from a more observant position, we would call it the attack was from within. In other words, it was not an attack so much as it was a takeover. The idea, they weren't attacking the schools, they were taking over the schools to use them. They weren't attacking the church or religion, they were taking it over so they could use it against the people. So the attack really was a takeover strategy. Now you're getting into the more subtle aspects of what you're describing, but nevertheless, you described it very well. I think Yuri would give you an A+ on your report card on that one.
Well, I appreciate that. So, is it your understanding that this attack stopped with the fall of the Soviet Union, or that it likely continued under Putin, who was also KGB?
Well, now that's an interesting question because it opens up another door. Let's see if I can get my thoughts straight on this. You correctly used the word collectivism, which Yuri did not use. He was talking about communism, the classic Marxist-Leninist definition of socialism and communism, and didn't use the word collectivism. Now that's been something I've been trying to do for most of my work in this field is to introduce the idea that communism is merely one variant of collectivism. So is fascism, socialism, all the left-wing movements and some of the right-wing movements too. They're just variants of collectivism. So I'm glad you used that word. But with that in mind, the question you ask is where is this center of this attack? Collectivism is it, correctly identified, that's international in scope. It's not the Soviet Union, it's not Russia, it's not Cuba, it's not Venezuela, it's not China. Collectivism is this frame of mind, it's an ideology, and it has taken hold inside the United States. And it is now the cherished belief and ideology of some of the wealthiest Americans and Europeans who are not communists at all. They could even be anti-communists, but they're not anti-collectivists. They're brothers under the skin with Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin and Lenin and so forth, because they all believe essentially the same thing. And so the conflict between them is not over ideology or belief systems, it's a conflict for territory and control and dominance. Who's going to run this world thing that comes up? So now we're face to face with the fact that we have people in our own country. We're born here, we're educated here, in the collectivist school system, many of them now. And they are now, I see it, as the primary movers and shakers of this movement in America. It's not coming from Moscow anymore. It's coming from New York. It's coming from Washington, D.C. So with that, a very important flavor added to it. Yes, nothing else has changed except that this is international, and it's not Russia at all. In fact, in many ways, I think Russia right now is less collectivist than the United States.
Okay, very interesting. So from maybe a Yuri Bezmenov perspective, this attack could have been so successful that it has created people who are now perpetuating it within the United States.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
An interesting anecdote, I lived and studied in China for 6 months. And when I walked the halls of the university in China, you have the president's office, and then right next to the president's office, you have the office of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's a very clear message, we're keeping you in line.
Right.
I don't know if China is also behind a demoralization of America, but I can tell you that Chinese leaders send their children to universities in Australia and America. And so I find that to be very interesting. So both Joe Rogan and Elon Musk have asked the question about wokeism. Elon calls it the woke mind virus in our society today. And they asked, what is its origin? Where did it come from? And it seems like we just answered the question. It seems like the woke ideology is another embodiment of collectivism that may be the consequence of the process of demoralization that Yuri described. Do you think that could be true?
Yes, my first impulse is it's right on target. I'm thinking, sort of in the back of my skull here, I've forgotten the author's name. Anyway, you probably remember it. He did some work, he's an Italian, did some work on the conquest of the world through culture, the culture attack. And now that's part of this wokeism thing. The culture attack, it's just another way of saying how you brainwash people to abandon values of individualism, for example. All of the cultural, not all, because there's a morality aspect to it too. But what they want to do is break down everything that would be a possible bulwark against the acceptance of pure collectivism. And so they create these fantastic stories and utopian dreams and so forth, and hatred enemies among good people. They think that person, why George Washington, he was a horrible man, he had slaves and all this stuff. And so they want to break down traditions that might stand in the way of their conquest. So a lot of that wokeism is, I think, just primarily just to destroy the existing order.
Yes.
And then out of the ashes, so to speak, or the dust, the rubble, then they can build what they want with very little resistance. So the whole structure of this conflict gets very complex, and they have a little bit of strategy for everybody. You know, they're not the same face to everybody. They have one message for the working class, one message for the intellectual, another message for the young, one for the old, you know, one for the rich, one for the poor. They have many messages, but they're all in some way aimed first at the destruction of the existing order. That's the main thing, is to destroy, to destroy, to destroy. And I think it's, and then out of that, they can rebuild much more easily because there's nothing to stop them. But it's something to keep in mind, because early on, for most people, they begin to think, well, what's wrong with our leaders? Don't they know that these things they're doing don't work? I think we should write a letter to our congressman and tell them that what they're doing doesn't work. Well, of course it doesn't work. Then they know it doesn't work. That's why they do it. But the average person cannot understand that there are people out there who wear clothes just like we do, speak our language, go to the same schools we did at different time periods and so forth, and they're trying to destroy our system, not to preserve it or make it work. They want to make it not work so that they can build out of the ashes. Yeah. And that's a very hard lesson for most people to learn. It was for me.
So Yuri Bezmenov also put forward what he believed the solution to this is. And it took some digging for me to find. But as best I could find it, Yuri said that the first part of the solution is religion. To quote Yuri, "My solution is simple. You don't want to be demoralized? Stay moral." I thought about that, and it's sort of profound in its simplicity. He elaborates on it a little bit. He suggests bringing prayer back to school. He refers to religion as teaching that individual rights, that rights come from God, and the value of the individual. And it feels, my read on his work is that it feels like that's his primary recommendation for the solution. He also suggests some other things. He says that you need education. You have to educate a new generation of Americans, this time in the spirit of patriotism and capitalism. And he talks about media. Start your own media, watch conservative and religious media. And then in the context of, you know, the solutions being religion, education, and media, he sort of provides this comment, which is, in any case, even if you start the education of a new generation of Americans right this minute, it will take the next 15 to 20 years to raise this new generation to the levels of power and authority. You may reduce this period of time if you can make an enormous all-nation effort in an atmosphere of prevailing unity and consensus. So I want to ask you, do you agree with Yuri's proposed solutions?
Well, there are many aspects to that. You just mentioned about 4 or 5 of them, and they all sounded valid to me. In my conversations with Yuri, I had a little bit of a different take on his view of religion. Now, this is something that was strictly out of our conversations, as I recall. I don't ever hearing him say these things in public, but I'm pretty sure we talked about this, and he said, of course, religion is important because it gives people a set of values that is other than the state. And he said, under our system, meaning the Soviet Union, he said, we opposed anything that people might turn to for help and assistance and guidance. It has to be the state or nothing. So we were opposed to religion because people turned to religion and they had fellow religionists who helped them if they were hungry or in need and so forth. And it didn't make any difference what religion it was. It could be Christianity, it could be Buddhism, it could be any religion. And they were equally opposed to it. It wasn't that they were just against one particular religion. It's because they were against that. They were against private clubs. They were against organizations that might offer help to each other on the basis of some hobby even, or like they were really opposed to people like the Kiwanis Club, and because they could do things for each other, and they didn't like any of that at all. So he said we had a lot of people in our country, meaning the Soviet Union, who'd been raised from the cradle as atheists, and he said they were atheists, and I think he alluded to the fact that he was too at one time. He didn't amplify on that, but that's how they were raised. I mean, you're born into it, so it's this normal thing. He said, and they still hadn't found religion as we think of it, but they still sure as heck knew that they didn't want collectivism, or they didn't want socialism or communism, and that he said, you need religion for the reason it's a place for people to unite and help each other. But even if you're a person of a different religion or no religion, you can see in your own self-interest that this system of collectivism is evil, and we use that word, it's evil to the core, and you do not want it. So that's kind of an aside on that view. Other than that, I would say, yeah, everything you said is right on target.
Okay. So for what it's worth, before I really kind of dug into Yuri's writings, I thought of this primarily as a philosophical or an ideological battle between collectivism and individualism. But I'm now increasingly thinking about this as a moral or a spiritual battle. Yuri did use the word evil, sort of between the evil of collectivism and the good of individualism. Do you think that is a reasonable perspective to hold? Do you think it's reasonable to think that there could be a moral or a spiritual element to this battle?
Oh, I think it's not only reasonable, it's logical. Now that's a hard word to use with something like religion, because all religions are basically a belief system, but the belief can be based upon logic even. So that's what I say. It's not just a feeling. I don't know what to say on that. I think it's a fair statement that this system we're fighting is evil by any definition, and you don't have to go to church, any particular church, to understand the word evil. You just know it when you see it, and you smell it, and you feel it, and you know it when you see it. That brings up something, though. I have to. It seems like I'm always saying, well, yeah, but don't forget this side issue, and here again is another side issue to that evil question, evil versus good. It seems that I've noticed in the last couple of years especially that the more desperate our situation becomes, and the more possible it seems that we might have to live through some very, very rough times in the near future, people are discovering their religious beliefs more and more. And that's fine. I think that's a good, healthy thing. I'm probably going through it myself, but I have other reasons. I'm 92 years old, which is, if you don't do it pretty soon, you're going to miss the boat on that. So, but anyway, so people start saying it's this religious battle or it's a spiritual battle, and it is. But now the rest of that is, well, what do you do about it? Do you just pray? Do you say it's all in God's hands? This is a spiritual battle. Is it all a spiritual battle? Only a spiritual battle? And if we repent our sins, we don't have to worry about those bad guys. Just leave them alone. We're the sinners. We're the cause of it because we're sinners. Oh, this is propaganda as far as I'm concerned. I think the people on the other side are trying to convince most of us to get out of the battle, get out of the way, leave the bad guys alone. You're the problem, not them. You're the sinner. All you have to do is repent of your sins and pray, and those guys will just go away. Oh, brother, I hate to see that idea taking root.
Very, very interesting points. So when I sought to understand Yuri Bezmenov's perspective, first was, understanding what he said, which we've talked through. The next thing that I sought to do is just kind of ask myself, is what Yuri said consistent with a Christian perspective? And I think it is, and I just want to take a moment to unpack this. A Christian perspective, and I'm saying a Christian perspective, not the Christian perspective, but because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of opinions here, but a Christian perspective is something along the following lines. God is good. God created the heavens and the earth. God created man in his own image, male and female, he created them, and hence, as individuals, we have inherent value and rights. The creation was very good. God gave individuals freedom. Adam and Eve, the first individuals who had freedom, chose sin. Human nature became sinful. The devil is real. Quote, your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Resist him. And then there's another quote, which is, we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. And then ultimately it comes to Jesus died for our sins, the Holy Spirit dwells within Christians, and Christians have a personal relationship with God. So walking through that biblical logic, it seems to me that everything that Yuri said is entirely consistent with a Christian perspective, a Christian worldview. And then I came upon something else that Yuri said, and I really went down a rabbit hole. So I want to take you down this rabbit hole with me. Yuri said that the result of the demoralization of religion is what he called the death wish. And this confused me. So I dug into it. And what I understand he meant by this is that collectivism is inherently self-destructive. And maybe even that it doesn't make sense as an ideology because you can debate it, you can defeat it, and it's not a very good ideology because it loses the debate. Maybe it loses the debate because it ultimately destroys its host. There's a self-destructive nature to it. So maybe collectivism makes sense to describe as a religion rooted in evil, not just as an ideology. And so I asked myself, well, has anyone else said this through history? Have other people said maybe there's a religious aspect to collectivism? And here's what I found. Just walk through a couple things. Karl Marx wrote in a poem, and I quote, with Satan I have struck my deal. He chalks the signs, beats time for me. I play the death march fast and free. Dostoevsky, in The Grand Inquisitor, wrote a story where the devil refers to himself as the spirit of self-destruction. And then Billy Graham, I think it was in the 1950s, he wrote, has it ever occurred to you that the devil is a religious leader and millions are worshipping at his shrine today? The name of this present-day religion is communism. The devil is their god, Marx their prophet, Lenin their saint. Igor Shaferovich wrote, the death of mankind is not only a conceivable result of the triumph of socialism, it constitutes the goal of socialism. And then to kind of cap this off, Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. So before I studied Yuri, I thought of collectivism as an ideology, but it seems to be a flawed ideology because it destroys itself. And I think now it makes sense to think of it as a religion, an evil religion. And so do you think that is a reasonable view to think of collectivism as a religion?
Well, I think it is a reasonable view, precisely reasonable, especially if you accept the concept that it's more of an analogy than a reality, because all of the original thinkers for collectivism in all their variant forms, whether they be German, Russian, Chinese, or whatever, and some of those that go way back before that, describe, without using the words we're using, they describe the building of the state to such a point that it replaces religion. And that I was talking about that aspect of it earlier. It's not that it is a religion, but it eliminates religion as a source for human succor and human retreat and health and repair and healing. If they destroy the family, which is the primary source of support for your problems, your family should take care of you. If they destroy the family, that's why they go after the family. They don't want people turning to the family. They want them turning to the state. That's where they control them. Or they want them going to their churches and so forth. If you destroy all of these things one by one, then what's left? There's still the human instinct to turn to something. And so what's left? It's the state. And so therefore you can say the state replaces religion. In that sense, people look to it almost as a religion, because who do they go to for help beyond themselves? Now, does that make it a true religion where they believe that there's an eternal consequence of their actions and their beliefs because of the state? I don't think anybody believes that the state is going to give them a free ride in eternity or anything like that. But they're not allowed to think about that very much. They just have to worry about food on the table and clothing and so forth. But the instinct to turn to something bigger than they are, something more powerful, something more universal than they are for help is built into us. And so I think our enemy plays upon that. And some of them have even said we must replace religion with a state. Now, they didn't say we should become a religion, but it's all pretty much the same. You can talk about it in different ways. In the end product, if you don't have religion and people are turning to the state for all of the things they used to turn to religion for, well, you can call it anything you want, but religion has become a religion in that sense. Absolutely. So that's why I say it's logical to see it that way.
Okay, so I've walked through what Yuri said, a Christian perspective on it. The final kind of piece of the Yuri discussion is I thought about approaching it from a scientific perspective. And the scientific method means taking a hypothesis, which Yuri had, making predictions based on that hypothesis and testing the result. And I mean, he laid out that an element of this was attack on religion, an element of this is attack on family. I think you can really look at any of those elements. I just took one. I took the religion piece. And so according to Gallup, the percentage of Americans who said religion was very important in their life has fallen from 70% in 1965 to 45% in 2023. Also, the percentage of Americans who said religion was not very important in their life has risen from 7% to 28% over that same period of time. And another way of looking at that is then, well, what percentage of people by generation think of themselves as religiously unaffiliated? Well, 9% of the silent generation, 18% of baby boomers, 25% of Generation X, 29% of millennials, and now 34%, more than a third of Generation Z. And so if you sort of apply the scientific method to Yuri's hypothesis of an attack on religion at the macro level, but then also an attack on religion by generation, you would expect to see exactly what we have seen. So I think that his analysis has a powerful predictive quality to it. So this sort of leads me to a big picture question about where we are at, which is, are we losing this war between individualism and collectivism? Have we lost this war? And then how do we win it? So however you want to take that, I mean, are we losing, have we lost, and how do we win?
Wow, that's a tough one. I wish I could speak with authority on that, but I will speak from my feelings on that. I think what complicates it somewhat beyond recognition is another trend that's been going on over my lifetime, and that is that people, very good people, very moral people, religious people, have gradually been turned off in some way from their religions because of corruption in the institutions. Now we're back to the attack on religion again, because I think much of that, not all of it, but much of it is because the religious institutions have been targeted by Yuri's friends back there. And so the religion has changed, and it's become a religion of collectivism in many cases. It's become a religion in which the leaders themselves do not practice the moral principles they preach. It's become a religion where there's a lot of corruption visible, and it's especially today you can see that. And so people are turning away from religion, and they are seeking these values from within themselves and their own studies, rather than from going to churches and buildings and listening to preachers and priests for their input. They're thinking this through now for themselves, and they're not calling themselves religious anymore, but there's a tendency to call themselves spiritual. I've seen the spirituality level is climbing. People are becoming more spiritual. Now it's a small difference, but I think it's a big difference in the context of what you're describing. I think religion, in terms of denominations and specific belief systems in the holy books and revelations and things like that, that is definitely declining because of the lack of confidence in the leaders of those institutions that are responsible for that. But I see, on the other hand, a great blooming of spirituality on the part of people around the world. It could be just the ones I'm talking to, because I am living definitely in a rarefied world. Most of the people I come in contact are aware of these things, for example, that you're talking about. I don't know what would happen if I'd go back to my old haunts back on the east side of Detroit, where I was born, and talk to the people over there. I have a feeling I'd probably get a whole different picture. So I hesitate to speak with any kind of presumed authority on that. But my feelings and my opinion is that this thing called spirituality is growing in direct proportion to the decline of this thing called religion. And I'm not sure that's a good or a bad thing or an indifferent thing, but it's something I've observed, and I think it's going on.
Okay. So you're the author of The Creed of Freedom, which is located in a paper called The Chasm. And to summarize this at a very high level in my own words, or maybe this is in your words, most of the political debates of our time can be divided into just two viewpoints: collectivism and individualism. And there are 7 key pillars that distinguish between the two. The first of which is the origin and nature of human rights. So a collectivist would say, "The state giveth and the state taketh away," which is a Yuri Bezmenov quote. Whereas the Creed of Freedom, from an individual perspective, would say only individuals have rights. And so I have sort of some questions about this. One is, you may have mentioned your perspective on this earlier, but I just wanted to double click on it. Can individual rights exist without God? And I know this is a deep philosophical question, but the view expressed in the United States Declaration of Independence is, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. And so, from your perspective, is God sort of a prerequisite for individual rights, whereas without him, we're animals? Where do rights arise within, evolved apes, if you know what I'm saying? So do you have a perspective on this, which is that a prerequisite, or is there a path to individual rights sort of without God?
That pause is, I'm trying to figure out how to organize my thoughts on this. As usual, it's like cutting a tree, and you cut it with an angle, and you look at the grain, and it's got a certain pattern. But if you cut it straight across, the same grain has a different pattern, but it's the same tree. So it kind of depends on how you cut the analogy and how you think of it and so forth. The word God, for example, is a trigger word. It should be pretty simple to understand, but everybody's got their different opinion of what God is like. Some people think God has a beard, and they really think of God as walking around with flesh and blood, or standing on. They don't think of God as a spirit at all. They think of him as a person. Well, it's not necessary to agree on that before we can deal with your question, but it complicates it because everybody has a slightly different self-image, or not a self-image, but a self-opinion of what God really is. Now, if you think of God as a person, and with gender even, that gets complicated. I don't think whatever the creation is, it doesn't have gender. I don't think it has to eat food. I don't think it needs gravity. I know all of those things. It's got to be something other than our dimension. That's just my view, and I don't expect anybody to agree with me on that. So if you back off and take the generic understanding of God as this force of creation, whatever God might look like, or how it operates, or is it just energy, or whatever it is. If you take that kind of a view, then you can say, yes, humans have rights granted by their creator, because my view is that we find these rights inside us. We have an instinct for them. This is our right. And you don't have to read a good book to figure that out. You're born with those instincts. And you're willing to fight to defend your life and your liberty. You're born with that instinct. Well, why do you have that instinct? Because it was put there by the force of creation, God. So therefore, you have to say, well, God, whatever your view of that is the source of your rights. But now, let's add one more level of complexity to it. You may have a right to something, but you may not be able to do it in spite of your right, because somebody else has power over you. So, or you may not have the authority to do it. I'll come to that word. Do you have the authority to kill somebody? Just take that question. Do you and I have the authority to kill somebody? And the answer is, well, what do you mean by authority? Who's going to give us the authority? Well, if we say that the authority comes from our Creator, it comes built into us, it's hardware, not software, then we have the ability to kill somebody if they're trying to kill us in self-defense. So the answer would be yes. It's a right. Well, where did it come from? Well, it comes built into us, and if we assume that we are the creation, the output of the Creator, then that statement is absolutely correct, and that's where I stand on that issue. But I recognize if you can interpret any of these words a little differently, you could come out another door.
Very interesting.
The point I'm trying to make really is that there's a difference between the right to do something and the ability to do something. We might say that we're born with the right to freedom of speech and peaceful assembly and all that, but if we had lost the American Revolution War on the battlefield, if we hadn't won that war, a physical war, we wouldn't be able to exercise those rights, even though we say we have them. So we come to the real world. A right is something that you should struggle and fight to be able to use if it's really your right. We have to do that, otherwise we're not fulfilling our destiny. So it's not just do we have a right to something, but are we able to defend that right and to secure it for ourselves and those who follow us? That's the battle we're in. We got all these rights, but we can't use them. All of the rights in our Constitution are gone except the right to bear arms, and that they're working on that. They're already gone. Nobody wants to face that fact. But when they can lock you in your house and tell you have to close your shop and take a shot in your arm of something that's poisonous or unknown at least, and you don't have a right of any of that stuff. You don't have a right to food or shelter if they can take you out of your home and they can steal your bank account because you said something nasty and all of this. We do not have these rights. We have them, let me rephrase that. We have them, but we can't use them because we've lost the battle, the physical battle with this thing called the state.
So the Creed of Freedom also says that the state must never presume to do anything beyond what individual citizens also have the right to do.
Right,
Now,
that's exactly what I'm talking about right now.
I wonder if that is, I'm asking, is that something that you view as a general principle to which there are exceptions, or if that is something that is to be literally interpreted? So an example here is, what about eminent domain? As an individual, I don't have the ability to take property away from another individual so that it can be used by the public. But the Fifth Amendment says, nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation, which the founders included in the Bill of Rights because it's part of the first 10 amendments. So it seems like the founders thought there was an exception to that principle. So I'm trying to wrap my head around how you think about this. Are these guiding principles that can have exceptions, or are they to be taken literally, meaning that you're putting forward a stronger individualistic view than the founders did?
Well, I can't speak for what was on the founding fathers' minds when they wrote that. I personally think that they hadn't focused yet I'm not aware of any writer in history on this theme prior to the current day that's ever vocalized this idea that the state cannot have rights delegated to it that individuals who delegate those rights don't have themselves. You can't give that which you do not have. Once that principle is stated, then it becomes absolute. There can be no exceptions. And that's how I view it. Now, that's not as bad as it may sound, because let's take eminent domain. If it could be demonstrated in a court of law, that's what we have courts for. There's some gray areas and they need to be adjudicated. If it can be proven and demonstrated in open debate in a court of law and objective and all of that, all the desirable things, that you need to take a piece of property in order to protect the life and liberty of citizens, then you have a right to take that property because you're fulfilling the right to defend your life and your liberty. Now, if you're taking it because you want to put up an apartment building and make some money on it and provide low-cost housing for some group of people, you don't have a right to do that. Therefore, you cannot use eminent domain for that purpose. So in my view, you have to start now talking about what are you going to use this property for, not just do you have a right to take it. The right to take it depends on your intended use, and you better be pretty clear in your thinking to defend your position when you try it.
Okay. So the next kind of pillar is group supremacy, and a collectivist would say the greater good of the greater number. And on that basis, the collectivist would say it's acceptable to sacrifice individuals for the state. Individualism would say that only individuals are real and only individuals have rights, and that groups are just a collection of individuals. And, I note that America was founded as a republic. The Pledge of Allegiance says, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." And so the republic prevents mob rule, prevents 51% of the people taking away the rights of 49% of the people. And I note that where I come from, Australia, there is no Bill of Rights, certainly no constitutional Bill of Rights. So the government can violate the natural rights of Australian people to keep and bear arms, which they have, and violate their freedom of assembly and their freedom of speech, which it did during the pandemic. And so I note that sort of Republican element of the American experiment. And so about this, I sort of have two questions. One is, some people who challenge individualism would say, well, isn't the family a group? I mean, is the answer to that no, the family is not a group. The family is two individuals voluntarily uniting to raise children to become individuals. Is that the correct answer to people who try to treat a family group as an exception to an individualist view?
That's a good one. I've actually struggled with that one too, because you have polarity in that one. But you have to choose. You can't just think about it forever. And I would say that the family, for some reason which I cannot articulate yet, does have a special status because of the, let's use the word moral obligation, ethical obligation for the parents to provide for their children. And so there's an obligation question involved here. In order to fulfill your obligation, you have to have dominion over the children. You cannot perform that without dominion.
Yeah.
Now that needs some more thought, but I think if you sit down with it and stare at the wall long enough and write out your thoughts, you'll come up with a pretty coherent argument. And it has to be not just an argument, but a coherent one, a correct one. It's not just to win the debate, but to be right. These things are so important. You can't just play the game of, well, I beat you in that debate, so I win.
Yes.
No. But I think the family, because of the ethical obligation for the parents to protect and raise their children, they do have a right that comes with that. And but
Okay.
don't ask me to explain it any better than.
No, very interesting. And so then the other question I had on this is, as a general principle, do you support laws that make it easier for an officer of a corporation to be held liable for the acts of the corporation and for a politician to be held liable for actions committed in office?
No, because I don't want it to be easier to be held liable. I want it to be absolute positive. It's not easy or hard. That's the problem, because as long as you got a variable you can squeeze by it, you got a good attorney. I think officers, decision makers of a corporation should absolutely, without exception, be held liable and responsible for their actions. They should not hide behind the curtain of the corporation. If they would do that, 99, probably 100% of all the evils of corporate activity would vanish overnight.
But then so what's the solution here? Is it making it easier to hold officers of a corporation liable? And if not easier, what's the word I'm looking for?
Well, it should be absolute. It should be default. That should be the default position.
Okay. What about with politicians? Because it seems like I can't think of many politicians who have been held liable for terrible decisions. They have a level of immunity. Do you think that there should be a more accessible way to pierce that immunity?
Yes, absolutely. It's the same issue, really.
Okay.
They should be absolutely responsible. Now, that means they're going to be more careful, much more careful.
Yeah, it would.
Yeah. And as I say, all the evils, let's use that word again, of the corporate world, evils of runaway government agencies and so forth, they disappear. All you need is a couple of people at the head who used to be able to get away with murder, literally. Let's take a look at the pharmaceutical industry, where they deliberately hide information that shows that their drugs are poisonous or deadly. They hide it, they conceal it, and 5 years later, it's all brought out in the open, and oh, that was a terrible thing to do. The corporation is given a $500 million fine, and the guys that made the decision get promotions and bonuses.
Yeah, and they made more
Something
than that.
wrong
They
with
made
that
more than that
picture.
on the drug. Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next pillar is coercion versus freedom, and the collectivist view is that the state should provide, and the individualist view is that individuals have a responsibility to provide, but it must be voluntary, and that charity is better than taxation. And kind of extending upon that, people on welfare become dependent on the government, and the government becomes dependent, the bureaucrats become dependent on having people on welfare. So it creates this terrible cycle. And it reminds me of that quote, "Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome." A Christian perspective seems to be consistent with the individualist perspective. The God loves a cheerful giver. And one thing that was really interesting to me is that the Bible also says, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat, right? And then there's the question of taxes, where Jesus said, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God's. So when you think about tax versus charity, what's the principle, or what's the direction for which taxes are acceptable? Or should be? Which taxes should be acceptable?
Yes, I think the answer to that is the same as with the question of eminent domain. If the service provided by the state is wholly intended to preserve or protect or defend life and liberty, then this is something that justifies the use of compulsion. That would be...
To say that back to you, I don't mean to interrupt, but to say that back to you, the principle is define a small number of things that justify the role of the state.
Exactly.
And try not, and taxation within those things is acceptable, eminent domain within those things is acceptable. But the moment you have scope creep beyond those things, it becomes a slippery slope.
It does become a slippery slope, and very quickly it becomes a vertical cliff.
Yes.
And, so yeah, that's the whole secret. It's not a question of what the government can do. It's the question of why they are doing it.
Yeah.
If you just say, well, it needs to be done, it's a good thing to do. These people need more money. These people need education. These people need protection and so forth. Okay, Does that give me the right to go to my neighbor with a gun or a knife and say, open your wallet because I have a good cause I want to take your money for? No, it doesn't do that. So once you understand that principle, if an individual cannot use coercion against his neighbor for something, he cannot delegate that power to a bureaucrat or a politician. And that
With the exception of the small number of things that we come together saying the government is instituted for these purposes.
yes, to the defense of life and liberty. Period. Door is closed.
Okay.
Now that's a complete change. If we look at the laws that are on the books today, I'm going to guess that probably at least 95% of them are in violation of this principle.
Yes.
And that's the problem with our world today.
Okay, so then the fourth is private property, the fifth is money without coercion, the sixth is equality versus inequality, and I find this to be a very interesting one. And Yuri uses this as an example. He talks about how equality is subverted. He says, the Constitution says we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That they're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yuri then goes on to say that from his perspective, people who are unequal, we have unequal height, some people have unequal intelligence, should have roughly equal opportunities. And so I wanted to ask you how to think about this concept of equality. One way of thinking about it is equality under the law, and I assume that you would agree that equality under the law is a principle that should be followed. What about equality of opportunity? Is equality of opportunity the same thing, or is that a different thing to equality under the law? And this is before we come to equality of outcome, which is obviously a terrible doctrine.
It's a verboten.
But equality under the law versus equality of opportunity. How do you think about this?
Well, I'm thinking about it now. It's a good question. I think we can't answer that question until we define opportunity. Now, what does opportunity mean? That it could be defined in a lot of different ways, but I think that the general consciousness of a person that's trying to come up with what is fair for everyone and equal for everyone is that no one be given any advantage over another person that derives from the power of the state. See, that's where it gets really unequal. You have a lot of money, you can buy politicians, you can ask them to write laws that give you competitive advantage over your competitors. You get special tax breaks, you get territorial exclusivity, all these things. If you didn't have advantages over your competition provided by the state, and that was removed, at the moment I'm thinking that would be fair opportunity then for everybody else.
Okay. And now we come to equality of outcome, which seems like one of the most damaging doctrines ever created, because when you start talking about equality of outcome, you have to have the state build a bureaucratic apparatus that can take enough in order to give it, and then can decide who should have it. Now it becomes about one group competing with another. And I think a principle that probably makes sense is that reverse racism seems racist to me.
Well, by definition, it is.
Right. So how do you think about equality of outcome?
Well, first of all, I think it's impossible. It's actually physically, ideologically, realistically impossible. Everybody has different qualities and different strengths and weaknesses. Wouldn't it be horrible if we all had the same equality of outcome? Life would be so boring and so unjust. So it's a natural thing that some of us are superior than others in certain areas, and we're inferior than others in other areas, and that's what makes conversation between us and activity between us so interesting, is that we're different. Now, anybody that would advocate that everybody be exactly the same in all qualities is insane. First of all, it's impossible, and secondly, it would ruin human nature. It would ruin even being worth alive. It would be awful.
It's the anthill analogy, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and then the seventh pillar is the proper role of the state, and I think this kind of brings full circle much of our discussion
Yeah.
about the creed of freedom, which says that the proper function of the state is to protect the lives, liberty, and property of its citizens, nothing more. That state is best which governs least. So this is then, to the extent that there are exceptions to the other principles, you would use this as then the guiding theme for how far the state can go.
Yeah, that's kind of the umbrella idea over everything else.
Okay.
Yeah.
I saw in a previous interview that you mentioned that you were working on actually publishing a book about the creed of freedom. Is that still the case? And are you planning
That is
to?
still the case. In fact, you mentioned that, did you mention the chasm that,
I did, yes.
yeah, well, that's sort of a preview of
Okay.
all the information that pertains to collectivism versus individualism. At least the first draft is in that 50-page document. But of course, that leaves out all of the peripheral information about events in history that support this concept
Okay.
and prove it. And that's where it'll be more interesting reading, I think. I'm still working on it.
Well, I'm fascinated to see that. So I've asked you about sort of Yuri Bezmenov and the Creed of Freedom. I would love to ask, you have so many other works. I would love to ask you about your other works, but I just wanted to pause there and say, did you want to leave it there, or may I ask you about some of your other works?
Well, sure. Let's go for it.
Great. So, The Creature from Jekyll Island. My understanding of this is kind of the core thesis is historically, if the government wanted to spend money on something, it had to raise that money through taxes or debt. But then a cartel of bankers came together with a third way for the government to spend money, which is created out of thin air, which creates an inflation tax that reduces the value of the currency over time. And the bankers could make money because it enabled them to earn interest on the creation of new money, which leads to a lot of money for them. Is that an accurate summary of kind of the core of the thesis?
It is. I would take exception to the word thin air. I sometimes use it myself, and then I say, no, I shouldn't have used that word. It's worse than creating money out of nothing, because they create it out of debt. And so when you borrow money from a bank, unless it's credit card money, but anything substantial loans, they want some assets to back it up. And they're your assets. You own them. Maybe they want a mortgage
Okay.
on your mortgage on your house. Move that off. They want your mortgage on your house or on your car or whatever have you. But a credit card is just your promise. So if you refuse to pay the money that they created out of a piece of paper with ink on it, then they get your car and your house.
They come for their pound of flesh.
A pound of flesh. So it's worse than just money out of nothing. It's money out of debt.
So, so as an observer of the Federal Reserve System and the banking system for many years, what do you see ultimately happening here? How does this play out in the long term?
Well, how it plays out depends entirely on us, and by us I mean those of us who are aware of what's happening in the economic world and who are resolved to try and reverse the trend. If we succeed, the outcome will be one thing. If we fail, then the outcome will be something else. So let's start with the unthinkable, which is, what if we fail? What if we talk about it and don't actually do anything meaningful about it except just complain about it and write a letter to our congressman or something like that? Then where we're headed is almost unthinkable, because we've never seen it in the world before in history, because the technology that now exists makes it possible for the ruling elite, the oligarchy, to control every living human being on this planet, right down to what time they're allowed to go to the bathroom, if that's what they wanted to control.
Are you alluding to a social credit system, perhaps?
I'm talking to a collection of different controls that they're working on. The economic controls, I think, will be irresistible. If you don't have money which you will not have if we lose. You will have something they'll call money, but it won't be yours. It'll belong to them, and they'll let you use it as long as you obey. So, and what you get will be in direct proportion to your ability or your willingness to obey their dictates.
So let me say that back to you. Are you saying in the event that the people who believe in individual freedom fail to move us towards a sound monetary policy, that you see the end result of the current system being, tell me if I'm using the wrong words, but is this something to the effect of a world currency with a social credit system where individuals can be controlled by the state?
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Exactly.
And by the way, that is also a Christian theme. I mean, the book of Revelation says, also it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is the name of the beast or the number of its name.
Mm-hmm. That's pretty accurate, pretty dramatically accurate too. I think that's what they're working on, and so that's the economic control, which by itself could be total. But now they're also working on chemicals in your body and electromagnetic signals that respond to those things in your body and in your brain, and they want to embed chips into your brain and so forth. So they'll also have control, if we allow it. They'll have control over our actual bodies and our thoughts and our reflexes, our muscle actions, our ability to think, our ability to resist. So this is a two-prong attack against the human race. And if we don't stop it, that is where I believe it is headed. I know that's where they want it to head, and I think they're making some pretty good, fast progress on it right now.
They are. And so what's the alternative? What does this look like in a
Well, the
successful
alternative is
outcome?
that we have to break that pattern and that trend. Okay, so the next question is, well, how do you do that? It's one thing to say, we got to do this. A lot of people send me emails and letters. This is what we have to do, Mr. G. Don't you know? We got to get these people out of Congress. We got to reverse these laws, and here's the law we need. I wrote a good law. You just passed it. You know, they don't understand that knowing what to do is not enough. We have to do it. How to do it? How do we get these people out of there?
Let me ask a clarifying question. Before we get to how we affect the change, what is the alternative? What is the outcome to what is a sound monetary system from your perspective?
Oh, okay. Well, that's more pleasant. I'd rather talk about that. A sound monetary system is one which is based on all the qualities of good money that I put in my book, The Creature from Jekyll Island. It has to be, fungible. You have to be able to. It has to be rare. It has to be hard to find. It has to have high value in small amounts. It has to be indestructible and so forth. It has to be portable and so forth. All those values. But one we haven't been talking about previously, but now we have to add it to the list. It has to be owned by you, because what they're trying to come up with is a monetary system where the money, defined as the medium of exchange, which is a good definition for money, not good money, but it's money nevertheless, that will be owned by the banks, the central banks. So if you don't own the money, then you don't really have it if they decide to take it away from you. They don't even have to steal it from you, because it belongs to them in the first place. So that's a sound money. And
is there a scenario where cryptocurrency, so a Bitcoin, do you consider that to be sound money, or do you consider that to be a part of the problem?
I don't see it quite as either, clearly. I see it's got one foot in each rut there. I don't think it's sound money, but it could be usable money as long as the systems are working. But cryptocurrencies are subject to technology, and that's the Achilles heel. The technology, they say, oh, you can't, there'll only be so many coins created and so forth. Well, I remember some years ago when the internet was coming out, they said, the internet, that'll save us. And I kept saying, yeah, but they can close down the internet. No, they can't. It's impossible. You cannot close down the internet. They got the satellites up there. Well, of course they knew they could close down the internet and see who has access to it or not. I have a feeling that give it enough time for AI to work its way into our world and for computers to get faster and bigger and so forth, I have a feeling they'll be able to intercept any crypto transaction. And of course, they can make it illegal and have severe punishments for those who use the system. And they'll figure with AI, they'll know who you are, exactly who you are and where you are just by your buying patterns. You won't have to have an ID. They'll just say, what did you buy the last 5 days? And they'll know who you are. So I don't think that crypto is a sound money, but I think it's possibly a viable money in a free society of the kind we're saying is our ideal, because then the laws would prevent the oligarch from using it in a way that would be harmful to the citizens. So it could be either way. Well, we know that everything that's ever been invented that had great power has wound up being a weapon of destruction of some kind. Atomic energy could be the solution to all of our energy problems, but yeah, who got hold of it? Well, governments got hold of it, and they made bombs out of it instead of electric current that comes out of your wire. And the internet, oh, gee, that's wonderful. We can communicate with each other. No, it was taken over by the oligarchy. They're using it more and more to control our thoughts, the information we get, and so forth. Everything you can think of that had great utility in history that's been invented has wound up being used predominantly by people who do not have our best interests in mind. I see no reason to expect that cryptocurrencies will be significantly different somewhere down the line. I'm all for cryptocurrencies. I have some. I think it's a pretty risky but nevertheless exciting speculative investment because the values will be going up. But I don't expect it to be the solution in the long term for our monetary privacy and efficiency. So what is left? Well, gold and silver. That's always what's left. And people hate it because they can't create it out of nothing or out of debt. You got to go out and dig it out of the ground or do something to make it and put it in a coin. That's very inconvenient, you know. It's so much better just to push a button on a computer keyboard and say, oh, yeah, we got $1 million here. Look at that. And so
a principle that underpins this in the Creed of Freedom is where you say freedom of the individual to accept or reject any currency.
That solves the problem. I used to say that I was in favor of the gold standard, for example, or the silver standard, or bimetal standard. And then I realized, well, wait a minute. The gold standard or any of these others would be enforced by law. And I just said elsewhere in my Creed of Freedom that I don't believe that the state should have the power to do anything that I don't have the power to do. And I don't have the power to force everybody to use a certain monetary system that I like. So I had to change my views on it. And I'm more comfortable now by saying, let everybody choose whatever he wants to choose. And in time, the best money will rise to the top and all the crappy money will go away.
Okay. So onto now the direction this is headed seems obvious, and you just discussed the potential worst case outcome. What is the solution to go to the desirable outcome? How do you get there?
Well, there are two ways to get there, and neither one are very pleasant, but one is more unpleasant than others. Let's start with that. Just wait till the whole system collapses and then try and build from the bottom up. And the reason I don't think that's a very good system, because when the world collapses the way I think it could be, I have a feeling that about 90% of the population would be gone. I think it would be that total. People would starve, they'd kill each other for food and water, or all kinds of things. It's a horrible scenario. And or they would just give up. Maybe there would be a lot of suicides and so forth. And even then, I mean, we almost be starting from the Middle Ages. I mean, we'd have no technology. All the books would be gone. All the literature would be gone. You just almost caveman style. But it could be done if there was enough. If our writings are left behind, and people still read, and they say, "Oh, well, that was what went wrong. We won't let that happen again." And that might take hundreds, maybe a couple of thousand years to rebuild. But it could be done theoretically, and so that's one option. I'm not in favor of that one. The other one is to recapture the system before it collapses so that we can keep it from collapsing completely, and pay the price, the heavy price that will have to be paid to take over what's the remnants of our legal system and our governmental system, our Congress, our Senate, our courts, our police, and so forth. And it could be done, but in order for that to be done, we have to be building right now those elements that will replace the oligarchy elements in all of these command centers, or these power centers of society. And that's why I am very diligent about creating what I call campuses of Red Pill University, which is one of the organizations that I have put together in the last 10 years or so. We want groups of people, boots on the ground in the way, in every county in the United States. And around the world, there will be political subdivisions similar to that. And we want campuses. We're calling them campuses because they're extensions of our Red Pill University program, which is a source of information and ideas, the kind that we're discussing here, so that we could use what's left of the system, the police and the army and the Congress and the Senate, the courts and all of that, the educational system, the media. We can actually become influential in all of those power centers of society today. We still can do it today. I don't know if we can do it tomorrow. It's getting pretty close. But today we can do it, so let's not worry too much about tomorrow and get going on what we can do today. And so everything I'm doing now is pointed in the direction of creating these campuses, which will be groups of probably, I'm going to guess, about less than 60 people in every county who will be aware of all of the things we're talking about, and who will be firmly committed to the principles of individualism, and who will be willing to take leadership positions in society in these institutions that I mentioned. For example, we want people to become members of the County Board of Supervisors, the City Hall, we want the mayor, the sheriff, all of these things. And we want people in those positions who don't want those positions. We want people, we don't want people who are seeking office. We want people who are doing it because they understand there's a task to be done.
Yeah.
And we don't want to wait around until election time and say, well, let's see who's running, who's on the ballot, who we're going to support. The game is over already by that time. We have to be influential enough in the community levels to see who is on the ballot in the first place in these positions. We have to build this movement from the ground up, not from the top down. It can be done, and today we can do it. Tomorrow we can do it. I don't know if we can do it next week or next year, but I say let's start now and build as fast as we can and see what happens. It's our only chance.
Thank you for explaining that. So a true grassroots solution.
A true grassroots. And we don't want any power over these groups to tell them what to do, but we expect only one thing, that they follow the creed of freedom and the code of conduct. And everything else is up to them.
Okay. 50 years ago, you published World Without Cancer. My understanding of the hypothesis is that cancer is a deficiency disease caused by a lack of amygdalin, which is found in apple seeds and apricot seeds and in other places. 50 years later, do you believe this to be true?
I believe it more than ever.
Okay. Is amygdalin a prevention or a cure or both from your perspective?
Well, it's meant to be a prevention. Amygdalin is supposed to be in our food supply. I think like all of the diseases, the chronic diseases that we have, we probably wouldn't have them if we were paid more attention to our food supply, because we're designed, we're engineered to not need medicines. If we just eat the foods that are given to us in nature and avoid doing stupid things,
as best we can. Then my other question about this is, from your perspective, is it all cancers or is it some cancers? And if it's some cancers, is there an easy way to distinguish, which this is applicable to and which it is not?
Well, there again is the question of definition of terms. The word cancer is thrown around a lot. Orthodox medicine says there are many different types of cancer, and they got a name for all this, and other. They got treatments for each of them. The people I follow as my mentors, the researchers and the doctors who are in the natural health movement, have a different view. They view all cancers as basically the same phenomenon. Now, it may show up in different organs of the body, and it may have a slightly different appearance under the microscope and say, oh, that's cancer of the liver, or that's cancer of the brain. But the underlying cause and the physiology of the whole thing is basically the same. And that physiology is that it's a deficiency disease. You're lacking something in your diet, and it's one of the things that might cause it is you have something toxic in your environment, and your immune system is not able to overcome it, and that's because there's something lacking in your diet. So both avenues of attack normally go back to your lifestyle and your diet. And there is one type of cancer that even the alternative doctors say is not classic cancer in their view, and that's skin cancer. Because amygdalin we've seen it work very well on every kind of cancer you can think of, but not skin cancer. And I've had many of these doctors tell me that they don't consider that to even be cancer at all, but it looks like it. And what they think it is, seems to be the consensus, is it's a kind of fungus that has tentacles and it grows and spreads underneath your skin. And so the treatment for that is something different than amygdalin and other elements that go along with it. So yeah, that's pretty much as simple. Maybe it's a simplistic understanding, but if you follow that understanding and that belief and treat it accordingly, the success is much, much greater than what you achieve under following orthodox therapies.
Okay, very, very interesting. So now, just to conclude, just some general questions. So, I feel like for some people, capitalism has become a dirty word, and we've been talking a lot about individual freedom. I want to make sure that we draw this connection between individual freedom, the free enterprise system, and entrepreneurship, founding companies.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who is an entrepreneur, how would you just sort of describe the connection between individual freedom and entrepreneurship?
The connection. Well, I'm trying to think of a good way to answer that, and it's not coming up. I have to go back and examine those words. Entrepreneurism. I can see that as taking different forms. I could see a free enterprise entrepreneur, a laissez-faire entrepreneur, or a collectivist entrepreneur. They could both be entrepreneurs. And the collectivist entrepreneur would do very well in a socialist system because you rise to the top, your entrepreneurship succeeds if you have political pull. And you can buy up politicians and do all kinds of things like that. But in a free market, in a true capitalist system, that would be impossible to do it that way. So entrepreneurship would have to be based on fair competition. So if you're going to have fair competition, and if you're going to regulate the society so that everybody adheres to the rules, you have to have state power. You have to have a police and a court to make people abide by the rules. But the rules have to be limited, severely limited, just to the defense of liberty and property. That's where people get off the rail. They figure, well, okay, we're going to have the state control this and make it work. So we can do anything we want to make it work, anything. No, that's not it. That's a big step. You have the power to make rules and regulations, but those rules and regulations which are backed by the force of law or coercion have to be limited only to the defense of life and liberty, or else you're on that slippery slope or that steep cliff that we were talking about.
Thank you. And then my next question is, it's remarkable the body of work that you've produced in your life. And I'm sure there are a lot of people out there watching this who aspire to research complex topics and invest the time to come up with potential solutions and breakthrough innovations. Whether it's I'm particularly referring to authorship. How have you financed that? I mean, did you was it, were you independently wealthy? Did you save up enough to, undertake your first books? Did the first books then pay for the rest? But like for someone who aspires to do similar research to what you've done, but they say to themselves, I've got to work 40, 50, 60 hours a week just to pay the bills before I could start my research. Um, you know, how did you do it? And are there lessons there for how other people who aspire to might be able to do it?
Well, I think in all honesty, I have to say it was a mixture of luck and and maybe it's all luck. I don't know, but I did have to work hard. I put a lot of work into it, and a certain amount of discipline to keep on the track when I wanted to quit. But good fortune is hard to beat. And so the reason I'm saying that is that as a young man starting down this path, my training was all in entertainment. It was in speech and communications. I was going into the theater, I was a child actor on radio and all that stuff. And I was going to go to Hollywood and be another Cecil B. DeMille or something like that. Well, that didn't work out because when I got to Hollywood, I found out there were people with more talent than mine by far who were wasting their lives washing dishes and cleaning cars and everything, waiting for the big break. By this time, I've got a little family to support. So I jumped over and I got a real job in the corporate world and all that sort of thing. But so after I was climbing the corporate ladder pretty well, and I started to take an interest in what was going on in the real world. And I discovered I had a crusader gene. I said, oh my gosh, what am I learning? All this stuff is not what I thought. We're in trouble. So I quit my job, and my poor wife almost had a fit. She said, well, how are we going to put groceries on the table? And I had to say, I don't know. So I started to give speeches. Well, I knew how to do that. But nobody wants to pay for a speech, especially a crusader speech like mine. But I was giving speeches, and I got a little reputation around town for giving some good speeches. Particularly, my first topic that I took an interest in was the United Nations and the great fraud that was behind that image. And so then I took it.
And just on that, the United, from your perspective, the United Nations is a collectivist organization. Correct?
Oh, totally. Oh, top to bottom, yeah. And they're proud of it. They don't pull their punches on it.
Okay.
They advocate all of collectivism, top to bottom. And so anyway, after that, I became ill. I worked too hard. I was probably drinking too much. I was traveling around giving speeches, training people I made a couple of films and so forth. And I came back one day from a 1-month tour. I went out to plant a tree in my front yard, and I collapsed. I was paralyzed. Well, make a long story short, two doctors diagnosed me as having multiple sclerosis. I didn't really know what that was, but I looked it up in the encyclopedia, and I thought, oh, brother, that's the end of the line, and it's a bad way to go, and I thought I was through. And so at this stage, a couple of weeks into that, I got a call from a book publisher, and they said, Ed, how would you like to write a book for us on the United Nations? You've been giving speeches and people like it, and we want to produce a book on that. Would you be interested? Well, I couldn't write. I never was good at writing. I never tried it very much. And I wanted to say, but I can't write. But I had to earn some money for my family, So I found myself saying, oh, no problem. So I got the contract to write this book. I had no idea how to do it, but I finished up my research. It took me a month or two, I guess, more than that. Finally, it came the day to write. And if you've seen movies on writers with writer's block, they can't write. They type something on the typewriter and then pull the paper out and throw it away. That was me in real life. I couldn't write. And I'd spent half a morning one day. It was time to write, and I was in despair, panic, actually. And I found myself saying, darn it, just write, Mary Had a Little Lamb, write something on a bloody piece of paper. So I just started to scribble and just forced my hand into motion. And the first thing I thought, well, how do I tackle the topic of the United Nations? Well, maybe I'll start with that. And I wrote that down. And then I thought of an idea. Well, maybe, this subject is so big, it's like a large glass globe, too big to grasp in your entirety. You can't even hold it. I wrote that down, and all of a sudden I was writing this down, and I looked, and I had 3 pages written. And I went back and read it, and those are the 3 pages that are in that book, the first book I wrote. Just pretty much as I wrote it. I said, oh my gosh, I can write. Now, I get to tell you that story because I didn't know I could write. And the good fortune in this story, the good fortune is that I got sick.
Hmm.
And my life is full of things like that. I come up against real heavy blocks, obstacles, huge trees fall across my road. And in each case, it's forced me to deviate my trajectory somewhat. And where I was headed in the first place was not as good as where it turned out to be later. So how did I do that? I found out I could write, and so I started to write. And I got paid well for the book, but it wasn't my book. Then it was time I should try this again. So I picked some more topics, and I began to write on different topics, and these I self-published. And they were selling, to my amazement. I tried to go through the normal channels, like I would send my book out when it was all printed to all the interviewers, the reviewers, and I don't think I ever got one good review. Most of them just ignored me because, first of all, I was self-publishing. And the industry is such that they only want books from the big publishing companies. I found out later why that was. It wasn't because they were necessarily biased, but the big companies have a deal they can offer these bookstores, and that is, we'll ship you some books, and if you can't sell them, we'll give you 90 days or 120 days, and you can return with the ones you didn't sell, and we'll take them back, and we'll pay you have to pay us only for the ones you sold after you sold them. So the big companies quite often will, at their own expense, stock these bookstores. And they know they can get the return any of them they don't sell. Well, a little company like mine, I couldn't do that. So they don't want to even deal with small publishers. So I gave up that. I tried putting ads in papers and magazines, and nothing worked. And then all of a sudden I started getting letters from bookstores, little mom and pop stores, and some of the big ones too. They say, are you the publisher of this book? And so forth. And I said, yeah. I'm talking now particularly about Creature from Jekyll Island by that time. And I said, yeah. They said, well, we've had a lot of people come in and they want to buy the book. So can you send us 2 or 3? Oh, yeah, sure. And then they'd call back 2 weeks later. Well, we sold those real fast. How about a case, First thing you know, they're coming to me because people were walking into the stores asking for the book. Now, I didn't do that. It's just for some reason the topics I pick, and I guess the style of writing, has turned all of my books, not most, all of them, into word-of-mouth promotional things. I haven't done any promotional advertising or anything after the first stab at it. So that's how I did it, which means I just wrote books and that took care of itself.
So you worked hard
I worked hard, yeah, but I enjoyed it. I enjoy it.
Yes. So I have an idea that I want to share with you, and let me preface this by saying it might be a terrible idea, but let me share it for you to think about. Something that I've found really interesting is the open source world. So I heard that you have perhaps the largest library of freedom content, or one of the largest libraries of freedom content in the world. My content like that, there's usually a copyright associated with it, meaning someone owns it or someone controls it and someone can influence its distribution, or cause it to be censored. Well, you can publish information under an open source license, and there are a variety of different ones, but one that I'm familiar with is the MIT license. And so what this means is that now anyone else can take it, they can publish it and make money from it, or they can add upon it, they can build upon it. And in terms of like sort of decentralizing freedom and freedom content, I just wanted to share a thought that perhaps one way to do that is to open source the content so that others can host it, publish it, build upon it over the long term. I'm not sure if you've heard of that or familiar with that concept.
Well, I'm not too familiar. I've heard of it, but I don't know the details. I'm glad to hear it actually, because my attitude has always been that my main objective with everything I'm doing is to preserve liberty, to save the world, so to speak. You know, what are you going to do today? My wife asked me. I said, well, the same thing I did yesterday. I'm going to save the world today. And it's kind of a joke around here, but that truly is my main objective. So if somebody takes my work and they pirate it or they make copies of it, well, I don't like it, but I'm not going to take them to court. And so I'm glad. I say I'm glad they like it so well they're willing to steal it. You know.
Yeah.
And I think I can't tell you. I've given speeches on this topic, and I put out some DVDs on it, and I used to put warnings on it. FBI warning: if you distribute this without authorization, we will invade your house, we will burn it down, steal your children, or whatever the warning was. It made no difference. People copied it anyway. And then I started realizing that, you know, there are tens of thousands of copies of that little DV that are circulating the world, and probably more than one person is listening to it. Isn't this wonderful? And I'm not doing it, so I changed my message, and now I say, okay, here's the DVD. You can copy this as many copies as you wish. We ask that you buy the first one, that's all. After you get one in your hand, you can make copies as many as you wish. God bless you. Just don't change it, okay? Just leave it alone. Don't add it or subtract anything to it. So I'm totally sympathetic with that concept. By the way, the largest collection is audio recordings that I have. They're not books. I'm sure there are people with, I have a huge library, by the way. I've got, I don't know, probably 5,000 books or something, but there are people with huge, much larger libraries than that. But I do have audio recordings. Long ago, when I first got into this work, I decided that the audio recording was a very powerful means of communication. I was learning a lot from them myself. And I was going to all the local meetings where some speaker was coming through on any aspect of health or liberty. I was there. And I bought myself a couple of very expensive audio recorders. They're called Kadulskis. And they're used in the motion, or they were then used in the motion picture industry for field recordings. And they took 8-inch reels of tape. And I bought 2 of them so that if I were recording a speech that went longer than 1 reel, I could start the second reel before the first one was through and not miss anything. I just have the whole thing. And I recorded, I'm going to guess, probably 500 of those things myself. And that's where I learned a lot, just listening to other speakers and then listening to the tapes again. And there was only one person that I knew of that had more recordings than I, and he was an engineer that worked for IBM. And interestingly enough, he had the same recorders that I did. And but he had been at it longer, and he was in the northern part of the state, so he picked up a lot of speeches from the northern part of the state, and I was running in Southern California. Well, the poor chap died one day, and all of his recordings disappeared. And 4 or 5 years later, I got a call from his widow. And she said, I understand you were making recordings like my husband was. I said, yeah. She said, well, I've got his recordings. Would you be interested in them? I said, would I? So now I have his collection and my collection. And the 2 of them together are undoubtedly the world's largest collection of audio recordings of these kinds of things. And I haven't even heard most of them that he recorded. So I need some help. I need somebody to listen to those and index them and then digitize the good ones. They're not all worth it, by the way, but it's like panning for gold.
Absolutely. I'm sure there are a lot of people who would want to help, and I'm glad to have kind of shared the open source idea with you. Well, I've tried to talk through your major works and take a deep dive, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do that and to speak with you. Are there any other thoughts that you'd like to share, or any kind of major works that you've worked on over the years that I haven't touched on that you'd like to mention?
Well, I can't imagine what you haven't touched on, but you did touch on something I'd like to talk about briefly, and that is this booklet called The Chasm. I'm going to hold it up here so people can see what it looks like. This is that, well, it looks like it's backwards. Is it just my view?
No, it looks good to me. It looks good to me.
Okay, I guess I've got the mirror version. Anyway, this is called The Chasm, and this is 50 pages of what will be my next book, probably called this Chasm as well. But I decided everything that I could think of about collectivism versus individualism should be put here and made available. So it's available free. If anybody wants it, you can just download it. And I urge you to read it and think about it. It could change your whole way of looking at government and what the world could be like if it was done correctly. So if you want this free as a download, you go on the internet, and it's Chasm, spelled CHASM. So it's chasm.realityzone.com. So it's chasm.realityzone.com. And you can download this for free. I urge you to do it. Other than that, I mean, if people really understood the issues that we've been talking about behind collectivism versus individualism, it would change the world. Because literally, I've not found any major issue that concerns us today that isn't rooted in a misunderstanding of this issue. They think that collectivism is good, and they think that individualism, whatever that is, it must be selfish. And that's the beginning of all of our problems.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity and for your time.
Well, thank you, and thank you for reading all my stuff. You obviously have read it and digested it and outlined it. I was very impressed by that. I think you did a better job of outlining some of these things than I could do. So thank you for that.
I appreciate that, and I did my best. The volume of your work made that there's certainly more that I will read, but I did the best that I could, and I appreciate you saying that.
You really did. Well, good luck to you, and thanks for having me on.
All right, take care. All the best. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
This episode of The Matt Sweeny Show is open sourced under the MIT license. You are free to download, use, copy, modify, merge, publish, distribute, sublicense, sell. Yes, you can use it commercially, so long as you include this notice and link to mattsweeneyshow.com. Thank you to my beautiful wife, Tusculum University, listener kids, and our contributors for making this episode possible. Support freedom and more episodes like this by contributing at mattsweeneyshow.com.